Her ex-husband left her for another woman and invited her to the wedding, to humiliate her. He forced her to go on stage, but she took the microphone and the whole hall fell silent. No one expected what happened next. Subscribe and write in the comments where you're watching from. The scent of pine wood and lingering smoke always reminded Aaliyah Brooks of her childhood home in southwest Atlanta. There, among the narrow porches and the rhythm of passing trains, she had first discovered her voice. Not just any voice, but the kind that made people stop mid-conversation and look up, eyes glassy, hearts strangely moved. Her mother used to say, "Girl, you got God in your throat," a compliment wrapped in faith and pride. Her voice wasn't just a gift, it was her identity, her lifeline, the one thing that made her feel whole in a world that never fully knew where to place a woman like her. Now, at 32, that voice rarely left her lips. Her apartment was modest, tucked between an overgrown lot and a shuttered hair salon, where a crooked sign still read "Glory and Shine." She lived alone. Even the shadows in her hallway felt quieter these days, like they'd learned to whisper instead of speak. The few records she hadn't sold lined the wall beside her small reading chair. Sarah Vaughan, Nina Simone, and her favorite, a faded live vinyl of Abby Lincoln singing "Throw It Away." That record, in particular, felt like scripture. Once upon a time, Aaliyah had filled church halls and college lounges with her sound, her voice melting into acoustic guitars and upright pianos, a soft storm of soul and clarity. She had sung barefoot beneath summer stars, on stages no wider than a porch step, and in front of audiences that had no idea they were about to be transformed. There had been a time, not too long ago, when she believed music would carry her across the world. Then she met Thomas Harding, and everything changed. She'd been 23 when they met. He was 2 years older, a third-year law student with an internship at a boutique litigation firm, and the smug composure of someone who had never been told no. Aaliyah had been performing at a campus open mic night, sitting behind a scratched baby grand piano in a flowing indigo dress, singing her own arrangement of Baltimore. The room had gone still. Thomas had stood in the back, arms crossed, watching her with an intensity that unsettled her, until, after the show, he approached with a smile and a compliment that didn't feel rehearsed. They began dating a week later. In the beginning, he was attentive. He listened to her songs like they were sermons. He memorized the names of her favorite artists, took her to record stores, and asked thoughtful questions about lyrics she'd written years earlier. Aaliyah, raised on caution and boundaries, found herself letting them slip. With Thomas, she imagined something that felt rare: ease. He seemed solid, promising, and ambitious in ways that made her feel safe. He talked about the future as though it were a house already framed, just waiting for the finishing nails. And in his vision, she had a room. For the first time, she allowed herself to believe that maybe, just maybe, she could have both love and music. That illusion didn't shatter overnight. No, it cracked slowly, quietly, over the course of 5 years. When she received an invitation to tour with a respected jazz ensemble, something she'd dreamed of for years, Thomas had listened, nodded, and then said, "But wouldn't that mean we'd be apart for months?" His tone was gentle, but underneath it pulsed a request. "Choose me." Aaliyah did. She turned it down, convincing herself that opportunities would always come back around, that love deserved sacrifices. Soon after, she stopped taking gigs. First, the out-of-town offers, then the local bar spots. Eventually, even church choir Sundays fell by the wayside. Instead, she poured herself into supporting Thomas's rising career. She helped polish his speeches, ran errands during late-night trial preparations, and hosted dinners for his colleagues, learning to balance glasses of wine with polite laughter and the careful performance of being the ideal partner. She told herself it was temporary, that once his practice was stable, she'd return to music. But months became years, and the woman who had once sung herself to sleep began to lose the habit altogether. The first time he suggested she tone it down in front of his colleagues, she laughed, thinking it was a joke. "You know how passionate you can get," he added, as if it were an afterthought. "Not everyone gets it." She nodded. Then, when he raised an eyebrow at the big hoop earrings she wore to one of his fundraisers, she left them in her purse. When he rolled his eyes at her humming in the car, she fell silent. She told herself these were compromises, that love required compromise. But something in her dimmed with each one. By the time she was 28, Aaliyah no longer recognized herself. She wore beige. She spoke softly. She measured her words. And she didn't sing. Not in public, not in private, not even in the shower. She told people she was taking a break from music, that she was exploring other interests. The truth was far more painful. She didn't know how to sing anymore without feeling like she was doing something wrong. Thomas's career, meanwhile, soared. He left the firm to start his own consultancy, specializing in high-profile civil rights litigation that made headlines. Ironically, he was lauded for being a white ally who truly understood black struggle. Aaliyah watched him be praised in magazines and on panels, while at home he flinched when her mother called and spoke in thick Southern cadences. One evening, after a particularly tense dinner party, he turned to her and said, "You know, sometimes I think you'd be taken more seriously if you weren't so expressive." She stared at him, unsure of whether she'd heard correctly. "I'm just saying," he continued, "if you want to be respected, maybe don't lead with your feelings all the time. Not everyone thinks soul is the same thing as skill." That night, she didn't sleep. The final break came not with a fight, but with absence. One morning, Aaliyah woke to find his closet empty, his books gone, his keys missing. On the kitchen counter sat a single envelope, her name written in block letters. Inside was a formal note explaining that he needed space, that he was moving into a short-term lease, that they should talk once emotions settled. There was also a signed notice terminating their shared lease. No confrontation, no closure, just disappearance. Aaliyah sat on the edge of the bed for hours, staring at the closed door. She didn't cry, not at first. She made coffee. She swept the floor. She took out the trash. Her movements felt surreal, detached, like she was observing someone else's grief. It wasn't until she picked up the framed photo of them at his law school graduation, her in a soft yellow dress, him smiling stiffly, that something in her cracked open. The sobs came like a flood. Days passed, then weeks. She couldn't bring herself to tell anyone the full story, to admit that the man she had believed in, sacrificed for, loved completely, had vanished without a word of explanation, that he had made her feel like a burden simply for being who she was. The shame was corrosive. She avoided mirrors. She unplugged the keyboard in the corner of her living room. She stopped answering calls. The woman who had once stood on stages and turned silence into song had become someone she barely recognized, a ghost in her own life. But even in the fog of grief, a whisper remained, a tiny, persistent voice deep within her, one that refused to die completely. That whisper, faint as it was would become the beginning of something new. And though Aaliyah didn't know it yet, her voice, quiet, bruised, and buried, was still there, waiting for her to remember who she had always been. Mornings had lost their structure. There was no longer a reason to rise early, no voice waiting for her in the kitchen, no hum of shared coffee rituals. Aaliyah began to drift through days like fog rolling across an empty field. Silent, slow, shapeless. The apartment, once filled with warmth and rhythm, had turned into a hushed museum of half-lived moments. Curtains remained drawn, dishes collected in the sink. The upright keyboard in the corner, once her trusted confidant, stood abandoned beneath a dusty cloth, a mute witness to the collapse of something sacred. 3 months had passed since Thomas had walked out, or, perhaps more accurately, since he had vanished. His departure hadn't come with a door slammed or a shouted accusation. There had been no final argument, no crescendo of voices, no line drawn in the sand, only absence. A decision executed with surgical precision, clinical and cold. The man who once whispered praises into her ear while she sang now spoke through impersonal legal documents and unanswered messages. It was as if he had erased her from his life with the efficiency of a man crossing off a task on a to-do list. At first, she tried to resist the tide pulling her under. She made lists, she planned errands, she tried to keep moving, believing that inertia might ward off despair. But grief does not respond to schedules. It creeps in quietly, disguising itself as fatigue, as apathy, as the innocent desire to stay in bed just a little longer. Eventually, the list stopped, the errands blurred, the days stretched, indistinct and formless. Time became something to endure rather than experience. Music, her lifelong solace, had become unbearable. The very idea of singing sent a sharp ache through her chest. She tried once, alone in the shower, humming the opening bars of an old hymn her mother used to sing. But the sound that came out was hollow, strained, wrong. She stopped immediately, water mixing with silent tears, her back pressed to the cold tile as shame wrapped itself around her ribs like a vice. Her voice, so long a source of power, now felt like a betrayal. Each note was a reminder of what she had given up, of what had been taken. She unplugged her record player, moved her framed concert photos into a storage bin. She even muted the TV when musical commercials played. It was easier to live in silence than risk confronting the enormity of what had been lost. The silence wasn't peaceful. It was loud in its own way, filled with unsaid things, with melodies that used to come unbidden, but now stayed locked inside her chest. It was during this time that Keisha began to come by more often. Keisha, with her cinnamon brown skin and wild, spiraling curls, had been her best friend since college. A dance instructor by trade and a force of nature by personality, Keisha never asked permission to care. She barged into Aaliyah's life without ceremony, bringing groceries, folding laundry, opening blinds as if she had a right to do so. She never asked Aaliyah how she was doing. She didn't need to. She saw it in the unwashed dishes, the dark circles, the flattened eyes. But Keisha knew something else too, something Aaliyah had almost forgotten. She knew the woman Aaliyah had once been. "You don't have to sing," Keisha said one day, setting down a bag of takeout with a flourish, "but you also don't have to disappear." Aaliyah didn't answer. She simply stared at the bag, her appetite lost long ago. "There's an opening at the Arts Center," Keisha continued, unbothered by the silence. "They need someone to teach beginner vocals, just one class with kids." Aaliyah blinked. The thought of a classroom, of children with bright eyes and endless questions felt overwhelming. She hadn't been around people, let alone children, since the breakup. The idea of standing in front of anyone, let alone trying to guide them through something she could no longer do herself, made her stomach twist. "I can't," she said quietly. Keisha didn't press. She simply nodded, took a bite of her lo mein, and changed the subject to the latest ridiculous drama unfolding at her studio. But the idea lingered, refusing to fade. That night, Aaliyah dreamed of a child with no face, standing in a sunlit room, asking her, "Why don't you sing anymore?" She woke with her hands clenched into fists and the echo of the question reverberating in her chest. The next day passed without incident, then another, then a week. But the dream returned, night after night, until finally, out of restlessness more than resolve, Aaliyah called Keisha and said, "Fine, one class." The Arts Center was tucked into a repurposed church building, its walls painted in cheerful colors and lined with children's drawings. The scent of glue sticks and tempera paint hung faintly in the air. Aaliyah stood in the doorway of the vocal classroom, clutching her notebook like a shield, her heart pounding against her ribs like a warning drum. The children were between 8 and 10, a blur of fidgeting limbs and loud questions. They greeted her with innocent curiosity, none of them aware of the battle she was waging just to stand in front of them. She introduced herself in a quiet voice and watched as one of the girls raised her hand. "Do you sing?" Aaliyah hesitated. Her mouth felt dry. "Not as much as I used to," she replied. "That's okay," the girl said with a shrug. "Maybe you will again." There was no agenda in her words, no judgment, just possibility. The class was simple. Breathing exercises, clapping games, a few call-and-response drills. Aaliyah found herself mimicking the rhythm of Keisha's teaching style, animated, encouraging, gentle. The children responded with unfiltered enthusiasm, their voices rising and falling in chaotic harmony. Something stirred in her as she watched them, something fragile and warm. It wasn't joy, exactly, more like memory, like muscle long forgotten, beginning to twitch again. After class, when the last child had left and the room was still, Aaliyah sat at the upright piano tucked in the corner. She let her fingers drift over the keys, testing their feel. They responded with soft, dusty tones, slightly out of tune. She placed her hands in position, closed her eyes, and without thinking, sang a single line from "God Bless the Child." The sound startled her. It wasn't perfect. Her voice cracked at the end, but it was real. She stopped, blinking back tears. That was enough for today. In the weeks that followed, she continued teaching. Slowly, rhythm returned to her life. Not the rhythm of before, not the beat of stages and applause, but a quieter, more deliberate pulse. Mornings had purpose. Her body began to move with more certainty. Her meals were no longer just sustenance, but moments of care. She still didn't sing for others, not really, but she hummed softly during class. And sometimes, in the solitude of her apartment, she whispered lyrics under her breath like prayers. It was during one such moment, sitting on her balcony at dusk, the sky streaked in gold and violet, that she found the courage to open the black notebook. It had been a gift from her mother years ago, its pages filled with song ideas, unfinished verses, and hastily scribbled melodies. She hadn't touched it in over a year. Her hands trembled as she turned the pages. Near the back, written in slanted cursive, was a fragment of a song she'd started but never finished. "They clipped my wings and called it love, told me silence was a kind of peace." She read the words over and over, each time more aware of the truth buried within them. That night, she wrote for hours. Her pen scratched across the paper like it had been waiting, like the words had merely been resting in the quiet, waiting for her to come back. And though her voice remained cautious, bruised by too many years of suppression, it had returned in some small way, not to entertain, not to impress, but to testify, to heal, to remember, because even when the world takes everything else, the truth, if you let it, always finds its way back. The evening had begun with an unusual calm. For once, the city's noise felt muffled, as if Atlanta itself had exhaled after a long, restless day. Aaliyah had just returned from the Community Arts Center, where her students had managed to butcher and redeem the same gospel hymn in a single hour. Her body ached in the pleasant way that followed movement, work, purpose. She'd even laughed that day, a real laugh, the kind that carried from her stomach and caught her off guard. As she set her worn leather bag on the kitchen table and reached for the kettle, the familiar sound of paper scraping against metal reached her ears. Mail. She rarely checked it anymore. Most of it was junk, occasionally a flyer or a bill. Her landlord liked to leave notes the old-fashioned way, handwritten and taped to the mailboxes, so sometimes it was worth a glance. Barefoot, still humming under her breath, she padded to the hallway and pulled open the little tin door. Nestled between a circular for a carpet cleaning service and a soft envelope from a child's literacy campaign was a thick envelope the color of bone. Heavy stock, gold trim. Her name, written in lupin calligraphy, stared up at her. She felt it before she read it, a tightening in her throat, a quiet pressure behind her eyes. Instinctively, she knew this wasn't a thank you card or a generic church announcement. The paper vibrated with a kind of cruelty masked as elegance. She opened it with trembling fingers. You are cordially invited to celebrate the union of Thomas Everett Harding and Jessica Marie Walton. The words were beautifully printed, embossed, and flourished. There was a small insert with directions to a vineyard outside Charleston, South Carolina, a carefully curated list of local accommodations, and a note that a formal attire was required. In one corner, a personal touch, Jessica's handwriting in a neat, studied line. We would be honored by your presence. Aaliyah's body went still. Her hand dropped to her side, the envelope slipping to the floor. She stared at it as if it might explain itself. It didn't. For a long time, she remained motionless, suspended in the moment like an insect caught in amber. Her breath had stopped, her chest tight. It wasn't heartbreak she felt. That wound had long since turned into something scarred and dry. This was different. This was something sharper. A humiliation so expertly veiled in politeness that it made her want to scream. Eventually, she moved, picked up the envelope, walked into the kitchen, and sat down in her chair. Her fingers ran along the embossed names again and again. It had to be a mistake, a joke, some terrible oversight. Surely Thomas wouldn't, but she knew better. If there was one thing Thomas Harding excelled at, it was performing grace while hiding the blade. When Keisha arrived 20 minutes later with a bag of groceries and her usual burst of chatter, Aaliyah didn't greet her at the door. She simply held up the envelope and waited. Keisha's face changed instantly. She took it, read silently, then let out a slow, disbelieving exhale. You've got to be kidding me, she said. This is a stunt. Aaliyah didn't answer. Her mouth felt dry, her throat coated in the chalk of disbelief. They're not inviting you out of kindness, Keisha continued, placing the envelope on the table like it might bite her. They want you to show up and feel small. That's what this is. I know, Aaliyah whispered. Then we're not going. There was something fierce in Keisha's voice, like the protective heat of a sister denied. "We're going to burn this thing and forget it ever existed." But Aaliyah didn't move. She stared at the envelope as if it were a mirror, reflecting every compromise she had made, every truth she had swallowed, every silence she had endured. Her mind flicked back to the moments when she had sat in that same chair, waiting for Thomas to come home. To the nights she had told herself he was tired, stressed, under pressure. To the time he said Jessica was just a colleague, and laughed at the idea that Aaliyah felt insecure. She had known even then, in the pit of her gut, that Jessica Walton was not just a passing presence. She had seen the way Thomas straightened his back around her, how his voice shifted ever so slightly, adopting the clipped tones of a man trying to impress. Keisha crossed her arms, watching her. "Do you want to go?" Aaliyah didn't answer. The next few days unfolded in a haze. She kept teaching. She smiled when necessary, but the invitation gnawed at her like a loose tooth, constant, irritating, impossible to ignore. She would wake up thinking about it, go to sleep replaying every conversation she'd ever had with Thomas, dissecting the motivations behind the invitation. She wanted to believe it was innocent, that perhaps Jessica, in some show of magnanimity, had extended the invite to show that there was no animosity. But Aaliyah knew the language of power games. And this was a power game. One night, she stood in front of her bathroom mirror, the envelope resting on the edge of the sink. She studied her face, the hollows beneath her eyes, the strength returning to her shoulders, the unfamiliar calm in her posture. She realized that it had been months, maybe years, since she'd looked at herself without flinching. What would happen if she went? Not as a ghost, not as a footnote, but as herself. She remembered her mother's voice then, soft, low, full of certainty. "If someone calls you to witness your own funeral, make sure they see you living." It wasn't about revenge, not really. It wasn't even about proving anything to Thomas or Jessica. It was about standing in a place where she had once been buried and breathing freely. She picked up the envelope. "I'm going," she said aloud, to the mirror, to the past, to her own uncertain reflection. And once the words were spoken, she felt the first thread of her old self wind its way back into her chest. The next week was spent in deliberate preparation. She didn't rush. She didn't panic. She moved with the grace of a woman reclaiming her shape. Her first task was practical, finding something to wear. The old performance dresses in the back of her closet were dusty, forgotten. She pulled out one she'd never worn, soft gold with a flowing silhouette. It had felt too bold once, too loud, but now it gleamed under the light like a second skin. At the tailor's, she watched as the woman pinned the fabric to her waist, tucking and shaping. She asked for the hem to fall just above her ankle, enough to move, to stand tall, to run if needed. She also returned to her notebook. She had continued writing since that evening on the balcony, quietly, without fanfare, just words, lines, fragments of melodies. There was one piece in particular she kept returning to. It had no title yet, only a theme, a woman shedding silence note by note. In the quiet nights before the wedding, she sat at her kitchen table and refined it, adjusted the phrasing, played out the chords on her long silent keyboard. Her voice, though hesitant, had begun to return in moments. Not the grand, stage-filling voice of her youth, but a voice tempered by survival, one that knew ache and still chose beauty. The night before the trip, Keisha came by with a bottle of wine and a playlist called Break His Ego. But when she saw the look on Aaliyah's face, serene, focused, she put the speaker down and simply sat beside her. "You're sure?" Aaliyah nodded. I'm not going for them. No, Keisha said. You're going for her. She meant the version of Aaliyah that had once believed she wasn't enough, that had curled into herself to fit someone else's shape. Aaliyah smiled. I'm going for me. And this time she believed it. Charleston welcomed her like an old southern ghost, all magnolia air and slow, sticky heat. The sky was the color of pearl when Aaliyah and Keisha pulled into the long gravel drive of the Vineyard Estate. The main house, a sprawling antebellum structure with pale blue shutters and arched verandas, sat perched at the top of a gentle hill, framed by weeping willows and rows of grapevines that ran like green veins across the landscape. It was the kind of place that appeared on lifestyle magazines, curated and perfectly lit, the backdrop for a wedding meant to impress. And it did impress, if one measured life in columns and pedigrees. Keisha parked their rental car just off the circular front drive, behind a string of black sedans and luxury SUVs, the kind of vehicles that didn't need introduction. Aaliyah sat in silence for a moment, eyes fixed on the house. Despite everything, she had slept well the night before, her body carried by a steady current of resolve. But now, with the air heavy on her skin and the scent of money woven into the roses lining the walkway, her certainty began to waver. She wasn't sure what hit her harder, the extravagance or the familiarity of it. Keisha looked over, her sunglasses perched on her nose like armor. You good? Aaliyah nodded, though her throat tightened around the motion. As I'll ever be. They stepped out of the car. The gold dress Aaliyah wore swayed gently around her ankles. She'd pinned her hair into a low, elegant bun, a small braid running along her temple. She wore no necklace, no earrings, just a simple bracelet her mother had given her, a reminder of something older than heartbreak. Keisha, in a dark green jumpsuit with a plunging neckline, walked beside her like a bodyguard made of grace and steel. Inside, the air was chilled, the kind of cold you only find in wealth. A white-gloved server offered them champagne flutes before they even reached the main hall. Aaliyah accepted one out of reflex and sipped carefully, letting the crispness ground her. They followed the flow of guests down a wide corridor lined with photographs of past Vineyard events, charity galas, political fundraisers, an anniversary party for someone's senator father. The walls whispered legacy. The ceremony had already taken place earlier that day, a small affair at a church nearby. What remained now was the reception, the performance. Tables stretched across the open courtyard behind the house, long wooden planks adorned with ivory linen and bursting arrangements of blush roses, peonies, and greenery. Overhead, strings of Edison bulbs crisscrossed from tree to tree, ready to glow when the sun dipped low. A quartet played softly in the background, offering a genteel version of Norah Jones. They moved toward their assigned table, a discreet spot near the edge of the courtyard, close to the makeshift dance floor. Aaliyah was grateful. She didn't want to be in the center of anything. She just wanted to get through the evening with her dignity intact. People glanced at her as she passed, some curious, others indifferent. A few recognized her, though they said nothing. Perhaps they had heard her sing years ago, or seen her name once attached to some community event Thomas had used for PR. No one approached. No one needed to. Their gazes said enough. They knew who she was, and more importantly, they knew who she wasn't. Thomas appeared like a shadow she hadn't seen forming. He was talking to a group of guests near the main table, laughing in that controlled way he had perfected, one hand tucked casually into his pocket, the other gesturing as he spoke. He wore a cream suit, no tie, a lavender boutonniere pinned to his lapel. He looked leaner, sharper, as if success had shaved off whatever softness had once lingered in his frame. When his eyes met hers, the smile faltered just for a moment. Then it returned, practiced and polite. He raised his glass in a subtle gesture, acknowledgement, perhaps gratitude. She inclined her head slightly, then looked away. She didn't look for Jessica. She didn't need to. Jessica found her anyway. Later, after the first round of toasts and a brief, stiff-lipped speech from Thomas's father, Jessica approached their table with a smile so bright it nearly hurt to look at. She wore a champagne-colored gown that clung to her like a whisper, her blonde hair in a low chignon, makeup flawless. She looked like the ending of every story Aaliyah had been told she wasn't part of. "Aaliyah," she said, her voice cool and perfectly measured. "I'm so glad you came." Aaliyah stood slowly. "Thank you. Congratulations." Jessica gave a small, approving nod. "It means a lot to Thomas, I think, that you're here." A beat passed. The way she said it left no doubt. This wasn't about reconciliation or kindness. It was about control. About letting Aaliyah know she was a guest in someone else's victory parade. Keisha's presence behind her was a silent pressure, a reminder that she didn't have to play along. "I almost didn't come," Aaliyah replied calmly. "But then I thought, why not? Closure is always valuable." Jessica's smile didn't falter, but something in her eyes sharpened. "Well, if there's anything we can do to make you more comfortable, just let me know." "Oh," she turned slightly as if the thought had just occurred to her. "We're inviting guests to share something later in the evening. Talents, memories, performances. I remember Thomas used to say your voice was unforgettable." Aaliyah felt it then, the tight turn of a key in a lock she hadn't touched in months. Jessica continued, still smiling. "No pressure, of course, but it would be such a lovely surprise." She walked away before Aaliyah could respond. Keisha exhaled slowly. "She's trying to stage manage your humiliation." Aaliyah nodded. "I know." "You gonna let her?" The question hung in the air, not demanding an answer but offering a mirror. The rest of the evening unfolded in a blur of toasts, forced laughter, choreographed dances, and shallow conversations. Aaliyah watched it all as if from behind glass. She clapped when others clapped. She smiled when expected. But inside, something deeper had begun to churn. Every polite nod, every subtle glance, every carefully phrased question that skirted her presence. It was all a theater, and she had been cast as the ghost of a former chapter. Present, but not central. A lesson, perhaps, a symbol. The MC, a man named Carter, who had apparently been Thomas's fraternity brother, took the mic around sunset. His voice was equal parts charm and arrogance, seasoned with just enough southern twang to seem endearing to donors. "Ladies and gentlemen," he drawled, "what an evening, huh? Love in bloom, wine flowing, good friends all around. But what's a celebration without a little entertainment?" Laughter, applause. "I happen to know," he continued, his eyes scanning the crowd, "that among us is a guest who used to be the heartbeat of our college jazz nights, a woman whose voice could stop traffic." Aaliyah's heart slammed against her ribs. Keisha stiffened beside her. "Now, I don't want to put anyone on the spot," Carter said, clearly lying, "but Miss Aaliyah Brooks, would you do us the honor of sharing a song with us tonight?" The crowd turned. Faces turned. Even the air seemed to pause. Aaliyah looked down at her hands. Her knuckles were white around the stem of her wineglass. "You don't have to," Keisha said softly. "You owe them nothing." But Aaliyah didn't feel the same pressure as before. Not entirely. There was a flicker, small, persistent, of something else. a knowing. She glanced up and found Thomas watching her, his expression unreadable, not mocking, not pleading, just waiting. Jessica sat beside him, one hand resting lightly on his forearm, her lips curled in a half-smile. Aaliyah turned to Keisha, who met her gaze without words. Then she rose. Not for them, not to entertain, not to prove, but because her voice was no longer something to be buried. She walked toward the microphone. The string lights had begun to glow overhead, turning the courtyard into a warm constellation. The MC stepped aside with a grin. Someone in the crowd murmured her name. She took the mic, let the weight of it settle in her hand. "I'd like to sing something of my own," she said, her voice steady, clear. No piano, no backing track. Then she closed her eyes and began. The first note rose slowly, shaped by breath, colored by every ache she had ever carried. It wasn't polished, it wasn't showy, it was honest. And before the first verse had ended, the courtyard was silent. There was a strange kind of silence that followed a moment like that. Not the absence of sound, but a suspension of time itself. As Aaliyah stood beneath the string lights, holding the microphone in her hand, she could feel the weight of the room bending around her. The murmurs had ceased. Glasses froze midway to lips. Even the clinking of silverware had stopped. Her voice, raw and unaccompanied, hung in the still air like mist over a river, stretching out across the gathered crowd with a gravity that no one could quite name. She hadn't rehearsed this moment. She hadn't prepared in any traditional sense, but everything in her life had been pointing to it, from the earliest days at her mother's piano, to the night Thomas had walked away, to every note she'd buried beneath shame and silence. It was all there now, rising up through her like water pressing against a broken dam. Her voice trembled at first. It wasn't pristine. It cracked on the second line, wavered slightly in the third. But she didn't stop. Her hands tightened around the microphone and she leaned into the break, allowing the imperfection to speak its own truth. The song she had chosen was hers, not just in authorship, but in essence. It was a song born in the long hours of grief, carved from the silence she had inhabited like a second skin, and now it emerged, fierce and unfiltered, carrying pieces of her no one had ever seen. The lyrics were simple, but their simplicity gave them weight. I gave you quiet when you asked for peace. I gave you stillness when you feared the storm. But my silence wasn't love. It was erasure. And now I sing, not to be heard, but because I am. With each line, her voice grew steadier, fuller. A warmth spread through her chest like blood returning to a limb long numbed. Her vibrato deepened. Her posture straightened. And something inside her, a delicate, nearly extinguished flame, roared back to life. She dared to look out at the crowd. The faces were varied, some wide-eyed, some frowning in confusion, others soft with recognition. A woman near the center wiped her eyes with the back of her hand. An older man had leaned forward, elbows on the table, his drink forgotten. Even the servers stood motionless near the far wall, trays tilted, eyes locked on her. But it was Thomas's face she found first. He sat frozen. His expression was unreadable, but something in the set of his jaw and the slackness of his mouth suggested he hadn't expected this. Perhaps he thought she would politely decline. Or maybe she would sing a safe cover, a pleasant, neutral tune meant to charm, not challenge. He couldn't have known she had written a song that would peel away the last remaining illusion that she was the woman he left behind. Jessica sat beside him, her spine rigid, her eyes sharp and calculating. Aaliyah didn't linger there. Instead, she turned her attention inward. She remembered her mother's hands guiding hers across piano keys, the warmth of her students' laughter, the crumpled lyric sheet she had slept beside for weeks. She remembered herself, not as she had been made small, but as she had once been whole. The final verse arrived, and she let it carry her. You called me wild, and I believed you. You called me too much, and I shrank. But I am not a cage for your comfort. I am a storm with a name. When the last note faded, it did not vanish. It hovered, reverberating off wine glasses and into the spaces between every breath. No one moved. For a long moment, there was only stillness, a collective intake of air waiting to be released. Then, without cue, the applause began. It started at the edges, soft clapping from one or two tables. Then it spread. Chairs scraped back as guests stood, their hands rising, clapping louder, then louder still. It wasn't the obligatory applause of politeness. It was something deeper, something born from a place that words didn't quite reach. Aaliyah stood, blinking in the sudden onrush of attention. Her chest heaved, her hands trembled. She hadn't expected this, not the ovation, not the release, not the overwhelming sense of arrival. Keisha reached her first. She had pushed her way through the crowd with tears in her eyes, arms open wide. You did it, she whispered, wrapping Aaliyah in an embrace that felt like shelter and celebration all at once. You took it all back. Aaliyah nodded, unable to speak. Her throat was raw, but not from strain, from truth. When she stepped down from the stage, hands reached out to touch her arms, her shoulders. Strangers offered kind words. Some said nothing, only pressed her fingers with quiet reverence. One woman, perhaps in her 60s, took her hand in both of hers and said, "That wasn't a performance. That was resurrection." Thomas was nowhere near the stage, but eventually he came. She saw him moving through the crowd with deliberate slowness, his face drawn, his mouth working silently. He approached her near the edge of the garden, away from the main cluster of guests. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Then he said, "I didn't know you could still sing like that." It wasn't a compliment. Not exactly. It was a confession of ignorance. Aaliyah studied him. He looked older than she remembered, or perhaps just more human. The mask of curated success had slipped, leaving behind a man who seemed suddenly aware of how much he had missed. "I never stopped," she said. Thomas opened his mouth, then closed it. He looked down at his shoes. "I was wrong," he murmured. "Back then, about so many things." Aaliyah exhaled. "Yes, you were. I didn't mean to break you, but you did." He nodded, slowly, as if the words were being soldered into him bit by bit. "I'm sorry," he said finally. She looked at him, really looked at him, and for the first time in a long time she felt no sting, no desire to hurt him back, just a clear, still understanding. "It's not about us anymore, Thomas," she said. "It never really was." He seemed to accept that. He stepped back with a nod and didn't offer more. He turned and walked away. Jessica didn't approach her. She remained at the table, surrounded by family and friends, eyes narrowed, hands folded. But something in her posture had changed. The confident tilt of her chin had softened. She looked like a woman who had seen a mirror held up to a truth she hadn't expected. Aaliyah returned to Keisha, to the warmth of the few who knew her beyond the past. As the evening wore on, more guests approached. A man in his 50s introduced himself as a music venue owner from Manhattan. His name was Michael Harris, and he had once managed jazz legends. He spoke with reverence, not pitch. "I wasn't expecting to be moved tonight," he said, "but that was something else." She thanked him politely. "I'd like to offer you a night," he said. "My place, the Blue Room. You'd have the stage, no conditions, just your voice." Her breath caught. It wasn't fame he offered, not promises or contracts, just a stage and the space to tell her story. She didn't answer immediately. She let the possibility settle inside her. "I'll think about it," she said, but they both knew she would say yes. Later that night, when the sky had gone navy and the stars blinked gently overhead, Aaliyah found a quiet bench at the edge of the vineyard. The buzz of celebration drifted behind her like a tide going out. She sat, hands folded in her lap, the bracelet from her mother catching moonlight. And she smiled. Not because the pain had vanished, but because it had finally found its voice. And now, so had she. It was the absence of noise that struck Aaliyah first, not the hush of anticipation like she had felt before the song, nor the reverent stillness that had followed her final note, but a different kind of quiet, the one that comes after something unspoken has been released into the world and cannot be taken back. A quiet where something ended and something else began. She lingered near the edge of the stage, still holding the microphone in one hand, the other curled loosely at her side. The crowd had finally begun to move again, voices rising into cautious conversation, glasses clinking, laughter returning in polite bursts. But the energy had shifted. There was no going back to what the evening had been before she sang. No smoothing over the rupture her voice had created. She had altered the room. She had altered herself. The first person to reach her was Keisha. She moved quickly, but not urgently, her presence solid and sure, like always. Aaliyah didn't speak. She didn't have to. Keisha reached out, pulled her into an embrace, and held her tightly, saying nothing. It wasn't a congratulatory hug, not one of celebration or excitement. It was grounding, protective, a reminder that she was not alone, even now, especially now. They stood like that for a long moment until the click of approaching shoes signaled someone else stepping closer. Aaliyah straightened gently, wiping her damp hands against the fabric of her dress, and turned. It was Thomas. He didn't speak right away. His face had lost the polished, easy charm it wore so often. There was something unfinished about him now, creased at the brow, softened around the mouth. His hands fidgeted slightly at his sides, fingers brushing each other in a rhythm that belied his discomfort. She waited. "I wanted to say something," he said, voice low and uneven, "before the night gets away from us." Aaliyah raised an eyebrow, not dismissive but cautious. "I didn't know you still had that voice," he added, as if trying to offer a compliment but failing to separate it from his own astonishment. She tilted her head slightly. "You didn't think I'd keep something that mattered to me?" His mouth opened, then closed. A beat passed. "I didn't mean to. Back then, when things were ending, I didn't handle it well." Aaliyah looked at him, really looked at him, and saw not the man who had left but the one who had run. She saw the fear behind his ambition, the narrowness behind his certainty. For a brief moment, she even felt sorry for him. "You didn't just not handle it well, Thomas," she said, her tone even, quiet. "You abandoned me." He winced, and there was no denying the truth of it. "I was scared," he admitted. "I didn't know how to be what you needed." Aaliyah's laugh was small, soft, without humor. "You didn't need to be what I needed. You just had to be honest." He nodded slowly. "You're right." For a long moment, neither of them said anything. The music in the background had returned to something pleasant and forgettable. Guests milled nearby, casting glances in their direction, some with open curiosity, others with deliberate avoidance. Aaliyah felt their attention like a pressure behind her ribs, but it didn't shake her. "I'm sorry," Thomas said again. This time, she believed him. But that didn't mean it changed anything. She inhaled deeply, then let it go. "It's not about us anymore." That sentence landed between them like a gentle closing of a door. There was no sharp edge to it, no bitterness. Just finality. He looked at her for another second, nodded once, and turned to walk away. Jessica didn't approach. She remained seated at the head table, surrounded by acquaintances and relatives. But Aaliyah saw her watching. Their eyes met once. Jessica's expression was unreadable, some mix of resentment and calculation, and perhaps something softer beneath that. Not admiration, certainly, but a grudging acknowledgement that Aaliyah was not someone who could be dismissed with a glance. Aaliyah turned back toward Keisha, who was waiting quietly nearby. Together, they stepped away from the crowd, moving toward the edge of the courtyard where lanterns swayed lightly in the evening breeze. There, in the shadows just outside the glow of celebration, a man stepped forward. He was tall, in his 50s, with a lean frame and a face marked by time rather than vanity. His suit was understated but well-tailored, and his presence had a quiet kind of gravity. "Miss Brooks?" he asked. She hesitated. "Yes? I'm Michael Harris. I was a guest of the bride's uncle, but more importantly, I run a place in Manhattan called the Blue Room." She had heard of it, a legendary jazz lounge tucked between two bookstores in the village, the kind of place that lived off authenticity, not spectacle. "I wasn't expecting a performance tonight," he continued. "But what you did, it wasn't just music. It was something else." Aaliyah opened her mouth, then closed it again. She didn't know what to say. "I'd like to offer you a night," he said. "At the Blue Room. Headliner, one set, no restrictions." She blinked. "Seriously?" He nodded. "Your voice deserves a room. That's all I can offer. No strings." Keisha grinned behind her. "Girl, say yes." Aaliyah looked between them, something inside her pulsing fast and bright. She smiled. "I'd be honored." He gave a polite nod, handed her a card, and walked away, disappearing into the crowd as quickly as he had come. Later, when the night had settled into the final stages of its unraveling, guests stumbling toward cars, servers gathering empty glasses, music fading into ambient echoes, Aaliyah found herself alone near the edge of the vineyard. The moon hung low in the sky, casting silver over the rows of vines. The stars above twinkled without urgency. Somewhere far behind her, Thomas and Jessica were beginning their life together, bound by spectacle and appearance. But here, under the open sky, Aaliyah felt untethered in the best possible way. She pulled out her phone and opened a new message thread. Her thumb hovered over the screen for a moment, then began to type. "Guess who sang tonight?" She stared at the words, then hit send. The reply came within minutes. "I knew you would. The voice never leaves. It just waits." Aaliyah smiled, tears stinging her eyes. For the first time in years, they didn't hurt. They felt clean. She wasn't a wound anymore. She wasn't a shadow. She was a voice, and she was ready to be heard. A month passed like a breath held underwater. Every morning, Aaliyah would wake up wondering whether that night at the vineyard had actually happened, whether the applause and the quiet offer from Michael Harris were figments of her imagination, a dream stitched from pain and longing. But then she'd look at the email confirmation from the Blue Room, neatly archived in her inbox. She would see the music sheets on her desk, the fresh ink, the worn keyboard brought back into her living room, and she would remember. It was real. It had happened. And now, something entirely new was waiting to begin. The days leading up to the performance unfolded with quiet purpose. Aaliyah didn't rush. She didn't scramble or panic. She moved through her routines with the same calm certainty she had felt stepping onto the stage at the wedding. There was work to be done. Technical work, vocal exercises, rehearsals, and she met each task with the seriousness of someone who knew exactly what she was stepping into. This was not a comeback. She was not interested in returning to a former version of herself. This was a beginning, and beginnings deserved reverence. She returned to the Arts Center, but now her lessons were tinged with a new energy. The children sensed it before she said anything. They watched her more closely. They listened harder. When she demonstrated a note, her voice rang out richer, fuller. One of her students, a boy named Devin, who usually refused to sing above a whisper, looked up at her after class and asked, "Miss Brooks, did something happen to your voice? It sounds free." She smiled, pressing a hand over her heart. "Yeah, Devin, something did." Evenings were spent writing, not just lyrics, but full arrangements. She reached out to an old pianist friend from her college days and asked if he'd be willing to accompany her at the Blue Room. He said yes, without hesitation. The two of them spent long hours together, testing keys, exploring harmonies, making changes that felt less like revisions and more like exhalations. It came easily, like music remembered rather than invented. Her voice settled into the songs as if it had never left. One evening, she stood alone in her apartment, looking at herself in the mirror. Not the one above the bathroom sink or the cheap square on the bedroom door, but a tall standing mirror her mother had once used for fittings. It had been stored in a closet for years, too large, too imposing. Now it stood by her front window, bathed in the golden light of early evening. She wore a black satin dress, simple and elegant, with a soft, structured neckline. Her hair was swept back. No excessive jewelry, no forced glamour, just her. She turned sideways, then straightened, then met her own gaze head-on. For the first time in years, she saw a woman who wasn't measuring herself by someone else's expectations. She wasn't wondering how she looked to Thomas. She wasn't trying to guess what Jessica might be thinking. She was not editing herself for palatability. She was standing in her own truth, unfiltered. The day of the performance arrived with unexpected gentleness. The city of New York, usually bursting with noise and urgency, seemed to offer her a kind of hush. The car ride to the Blue Room passed in silence, her fingers resting lightly on the music binder in her lap. Keisha sat beside her, dressed to the nines in an emerald jumpsuit and a leather jacket, hair coiled into a halo of curls. "You good?" Keisha asked as the venue came into view. Aaliyah nodded, looking out the window at the unassuming entrance tucked between two bookshops. "I'm ready." Inside, the Blue Room glowed with soft blues and deep mahogany. The stage was modest, framed by velvet curtains and bathed in warm light. Small round tables filled the space, each adorned with a candle and a single white rose. The audience trickled in slowly. Musicians, poets, old jazz lovers in pressed suits, young dreamers in worn denim, and, seated front and center, Olivia and Rachel, two of Aaliyah's former college friends who had taken the train from Philadelphia just to be there. Michael Harris was present too, standing by the bar, chatting with a silver-haired woman who played cello in the symphony. The hum of conversation built and ebbed like a tide. Aaliyah stood backstage, steadying her breath. Her pianist gave her a nod, and she nodded back. Her hands were warm, her chest lifted with something that wasn't nerves. It was anticipation, yes, but it was also joy. Not the anxious, needy kind of joy that depended on approval, but the quiet, burning kind that knew itself fully. The house lights dimmed. A soft applause rolled through the room, and then the stage lights brightened, framing her in gold. She stepped forward. "Good evening." Her voice, even without amplification, carried through the room. "I'm Aaliyah Brooks. Thank you for being here," the pianist began. The first few chords drifted into the space like smoke curling in still air. She closed her eyes for a breath, then opened them and began to sing. The song she chose for the opening was new, written in the weeks after the wedding. It was called Unwritten. The lyrics traced a journey from self-erasure to reclamation. From the empty pages of identity, once written by others, to the moment one seizes the pen back. Her voice rang out low and rich, rising with each verse, layered with nuance. By the second chorus, the audience was still. Not stiff, immersed. She moved from unwritten into Mother's Mirror, a tribute to the lessons she had absorbed from a woman who had taught her that a voice wasn't just about sound, but truth. She sang of kitchen counters and softly humming lullabies, of broken radios and stitched hems and strength passed through generations like a song hummed into the next breath. Somewhere during the third song, The Shape of Stillness, a man near the back began to cry. By the time she closed the set with Storm with a Name, the room was holding its collective breath. The last note hovered in the air for a full 5 seconds before dissolving. And then the applause came. Thunderous, sustained. Some rose to their feet immediately. Others joined moments later. It wasn't uniform. It wasn't choreographed. It was organic, genuine, blooming from each table like wildflowers finding sunlight. She smiled. Not the small, rehearsed smile she had worn in past performances, but a full one, wide and unrestrained. Her chest swelled with something she couldn't name but didn't need to. It was hers. Backstage, Keisha caught her in a crushing hug, shouting, "You did that! You hear me? You did that!" Michael Harris appeared with a glass of water and an expression that was part admiration, part awe. That, he said, was not a debut. That was a declaration. Aaliyah laughed, breathless and flushed. "Thank you." Later that night, long after the final guest had left and the last candle had burned low, Aaliyah stood alone on the stage. The room was quiet again. Not empty, but resting. She looked out at the vacant chairs, the scattered napkins, the faint scent of wine and applause still hanging in the air. She thought of the girl she used to be, the girl who had hidden herself behind a man's shadow, the woman who had swallowed her voice to be more acceptable, more manageable, more digestible. She thought of the silence that had nearly devoured her, and she thought of the song that had pulled her out. From her bag, she pulled the folded lyric sheet Keisha had handed her at the wedding. It had been written years ago by her mother, words penned in curling handwriting. She unfolded it carefully, smoothing the creases. She didn't need the words anymore. She had memorized them long ago, but she kept the paper with her, not because she couldn't remember, but because remembering was part of the story. As she stood there, eyes on the empty chairs, she whispered the first line. "My voice is not for their approval. It is for my truth." And that truth, at last, had found its place. Outside, the city buzzed. Neon lights blinked, cabs honked. Somewhere, someone else was singing their first note into the dark. Aaliyah stepped off the stage and into the night. Not a woman returning, but a woman becoming. If this story moved you, make sure to subscribe for more. Check out the next video. You won't want to miss it. And don't forget to share this one with someone who needs to hear it.